Welcome back to AI and I, where we take these complex topics.
Yeah.
We try to break them down and
Give you the insights you need.
give you those insights, yeah. And today,
Absolutely.
we are diving into a question that has been kind of swirling around out there. Could we see a Trump peace deal to end the Russia-Ukraine war?
It's a fascinating question, especially with, Trump's inauguration coming up in January, and
Right.
both sides seem to be factoring that into their strategies.
Yeah, let's unpack this. It's been, over 1,000 days now since Russia launched this full-scale invasion, and things have really escalated recently.
Absolutely.
Ukraine using those U.S.-provided ATCMS missiles to strike inside Russia
Yeah.
for the first time.
Yeah, and the timing of that, I think, is really interesting.
Yeah.
Because it coincides with this new report from Reuters that suggests that Putin might be open to freezing the conflict along the current front lines. It almost seems like everyone is anticipating this shift in the geopolitical landscape with Trump back in the White House.
But hold on a sec. Didn't Putin's spokesperson previously say that freezing the conflict was unacceptable?
Right.
And didn't Putin himself demand that Ukraine withdraw from all four of those contested regions, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, as a precondition for even having talks, even before Trump's election win?
You're raising a crucial point here. There's a lot of contradiction, and it makes it so difficult to really decipher whether this is a genuine shift from Putin or just strategic maneuvering. Is this like a concession because of Trump, or is there something else going on?
So this Reuters report, and it's based on conversations with 5 current and former Russian officials, suggests the Kremlin might be willing to actually negotiate the borders of those 4 regions, potentially even giving up some territory in Kharkiv and Mykolaiv.
Wow,
Yeah.
that'd be a significant development. But, we need to remember that Russia still has some non-negotiables. They've been very clear. Ukraine joining NATO is off the table. And they consider Crimea, which they annexed in 2014, to be Russian territory.
And that's where things get really tricky, right? Zelensky considers Crimea integral to Ukraine, and it's unclear what Trump's stance is on that. Could this be a point of contention or even a bargaining chip?
It's certainly a key factor. However, the report also mentions that Russia might be willing to discuss security guarantees for Ukraine in exchange for its neutrality.
Okay.
It's sort of reminiscent of the Istanbul Agreement from spring 2022, which also included demands for Ukrainian neutrality, limitations on its military, and of course, that agreement was never adopted.
So could this be a sign that those ideas are being revived? The report did say that the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, the U.S., Britain, China, France, and Russia, might be involved in providing these security guarantees.
It's certainly a possibility, but we have to remember the context here. Russia's economy has been hit hard by years of sanctions and the immense cost of this war. Inflation's nearing 10%. Interest rates are soaring. The workforce is depleted. Foreign investment is drying up.
The Bank of Russia is even forecasting a slump. And to really highlight the economic strain, there's this jarring story that Russia just slashed compensation for war-wounded soldiers by 2/3.
Wow.
From around $30,000 to a mere $10,000.
And the decision maker was Putin's own cousin. It paints a pretty stark picture of the financial realities that Russia's facing.
So could this economic pressure be pushing Putin towards a negotiated settlement, even if it means concessions?
It's definitely a factor that we need to consider. Wars are expensive. Even powerful leaders have to face economic realities. Now, let's not forget about Trump's potential role in all of this.
Right. His incoming communications director has been very vocal, claiming that Trump is the, quote, only person who can bring both sides together and negotiate this peace.
That's the narrative they're pushing. But we have to view it with a healthy dose of skepticism. Trump's history with Putin, his transactional approach to diplomacy, and his recent election win, all of this might be influencing Putin's willingness to even consider negotiations at this point. So with Russia facing these economic challenges, could Trump's return to the White House really be the catalyst for a peace deal? It's a question with no easy answers. This whole idea of Trump as the great negotiator who can single-handedly broker peace.
Right.
It's a narrative that's been carefully cultivated throughout his political career.
And certainly back in the spotlight. But as you said, we need to approach this with caution. Trump's history, his personal style, his past interactions with Putin.
Absolutely.
Those are all pieces of the puzzle we need to consider.
Exactly. Trump's approach to diplomacy has always been unconventional, to say the least. He often prioritizes personal relationships and deal-making over traditional diplomatic protocols. Think back to his first summit with Putin in Helsinki back in 2018.
Right.
That raised a lot of eyebrows when he seemed to side with Putin over his own intelligence agencies on the issue of Russian interference in the 2016 election.
Yeah, that caused a huge uproar even among some of his own supporters.
Right, and that unpredictability is what makes the situation so complex. With Trump, you're never quite sure what to expect. He might be willing to make significant concessions to Putin, perhaps even going as far as recognizing Russia's annexation of Crimea just to secure a deal and claim a victory on the world stage.
But wouldn't that be a major win for Putin?
Yeah.
Essentially legitimizing his actions and setting a dangerous precedent for future conflicts.
Absolutely. It's a high-stakes gamble with potentially enormous consequences. Now, some argue that Trump's unconventional approach could be an advantage. They say he's not bound by the same constraints as traditional politicians, which might give him more flexibility to negotiate outside the box.
That's an interesting perspective. However, there's also the risk that Putin will just try to exploit Trump's eagerness for a deal.
Right.
Using it to extract the maximum number of concessions, not just from the U.S., but from Ukraine as well.
That's the central question, isn't it? Can Trump, if he chooses to get involved, navigate this complex geopolitical landscape effectively and secure a deal that's both lasting and beneficial for all parties? And what about Ukraine's role in all of this? They are, after all, the ones bearing the brunt of this conflict.
That's such a crucial point. Any peace deal that ignores Ukraine's legitimate security concerns or fails to address the issue of accountability for war crimes, that would be a disaster. This isn't just about stopping the fighting. It's about achieving a just and sustainable peace.
Precisely. And let's not forget another possibility. What if all this talk of negotiations is just a strategic ploy by Putin? Remember, he's a master strategist, always thinking several steps ahead.
So you're saying he might be using this talk of a deal as a way to buy time, consolidate his gains, wait for a more favorable political climate.
It's not out of the realm of possibility. He might be hoping that Western support for Ukraine will waver, or that divisions within NATO will weaken their resolve. There's also the domestic political angle to consider.
You mean projecting this image of strength and control to the Russian people, showing that he's in command, dictating the terms of any potential settlement.
Exactly. It's a cynical strategy, but a potentially effective one. He creates the illusion of being open to negotiations while simultaneously advancing his agenda and keeping his opponents guessing. And we can't overlook the potential for escalation.
Meaning, if Putin senses weakness or indecision from the West, he might be tempted to escalate the conflict even further, hoping to secure a decisive victory before any real negotiations can even begin.
It's a chilling thought, and it underscores the high stakes involved in this entire situation. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what are the key takeaways we want our listeners to consider?
We're in uncharted territory, facing immense uncertainty, and the future of Ukraine hangs in the balance. There are so many variables at play, from Putin's economic troubles and Trump's unpredictable nature to the potential for further escalation. It's difficult to predict what will happen next.
But one thing is clear. The decisions made in the coming months will be crucial in shaping the fate of Ukraine and the broader geopolitical landscape. The actions taken and the words spoken will have long-lasting consequences.
Okay, so with all these complexities, all these unknowns, maybe let's shift our focus a little bit to the potential outcomes. What are the possible, benefits and risks of a so-called Trump peace deal, assuming one could even be reached?
Well, I think on the surface, a ceasefire would be the most immediate benefit. It might not be perfect, but it would stop the bloodshed, prevent further destruction in Ukraine. We can't underestimate the human cost of this war, and a ceasefire, would undoubtedly save lives.
Yeah, that's a compelling argument. But wouldn't a deal that simply freezes the conflict along the current lines kind of reward Putin for his aggression? And wouldn't that set a dangerous precedent?
That's a valid concern, and it's one that many critics of a negotiated settlement bring up. They argue that it would essentially legitimize Russia's territorial gains and embolden other authoritarian leaders to pursue similar tactics, knowing that the international community might eventually cave.
Yeah, it raises some serious questions about the long-term implications for international security. But what about the potential benefits for Russia, beyond just securing the territorial gains. I mean, we know their economy's struggling, so what else might Putin be looking to gain from a deal?
Well, a peace deal would allow Putin to push for the lifting of sanctions, which have been crippling the Russian economy. It would give him a chance to rebuild his military, reassert Russia's influence on the world stage.
And domestically, a peace deal could be spun as a victory for Putin, right?
Hmm.
It would allow him to consolidate his power and silence any dissent.
Absolutely. He can claim that he achieved his objectives in Ukraine, protected Russia's interests. It would likely boost his popularity and solidify his grip on power. But, let's not forget about the risks. What could go wrong with a Trump-brokered peace deal?
Yeah, well, I mean, we talked about the possibility of Trump being outmaneuvered by Putin.
Yeah.
He might make concessions that weaken the U.S. and embolden Russia. But what about Ukraine? What are the risks for them in all of this?
The most obvious risk is that they would have to make painful concessions, potentially giving up territory that they consider rightfully theirs. And even if they manage to secure a deal that preserves their territorial integrity, there's no guarantee that Russia will honor its commitments in the long run.
That's a crucial point. Putin has a history of violating international agreements. I mean, the Budapest Memorandum, where Russia pledged to respect Ukraine's sovereignty, their territorial integrity, in exchange for Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons. I mean, that's a prime example.
Exactly. So, with all these potential benefits and risks, I mean, what's the most likely outcome here? Honestly, it's so difficult to say with any certainty. There are just too many variables at play, and the situation is incredibly fluid.
Yeah, but if we had to make an educated guess based on the information we have right now, what would you say?
If I had to bet, I'd say that some sort of negotiated settlement is more likely than not. The economic pressure on Russia is mounting, and the war is becoming increasingly costly for both sides.
And with Trump back in the White House, it does seem like there's a greater willingness to engage with Putin and explore these compromises. But whether that leads to a lasting and just peace, well, that remains to be seen.
Absolutely. The coming months will be critical. We're entering a new phase in this conflict, one that's full of both opportunities and dangers. The decisions made now will have profound implications for the future of Ukraine, for the balance of power in Europe, and for the global order as a whole.
It's a good reminder that we need to stay informed, engage in critical thinking, consider the full range of potential outcomes, and perhaps most importantly, we must never lose sight of the human cost of this war and the urgent need for peace.
Well said. This has been a fascinating deep dive into a very complex and evolving situation. We appreciate you joining us and entrusting us with your time.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.